is a great place to start, right? Because Hungary represents the most sophisticated and probably the most moderate communist government to transition in 1988 to 89. And it also serves as, I think, the textbook example of what goes wrong when you don't take political culture seriously in institutional approaches to transition. So, the backlash that emerges in Hungary, which is embodied really within two parties, Fidesz, which is the party of Viktor Orban, and Jobbik, which is the more right-wing, xenophobic, quasi-neo-Nazi party, has a lot to do with the failure to come to terms with the communist period, especially making good on the memories and the narratives of the 1956 uprising. So the nature of communism, as I've already mentioned, was much more amenable towards reform, and it's something that we refer to as goulash communism, kind of a little bit of everything just for the sake of promoting stability and top-down control. But it's not a surprise that if the Hungarian communists kind of reform themselves, goulash communism kind of becomes goulash democracy, right? It's a type of bureaucratic authoritarianism that moves into bureaucratic democratization. So what gets missed in the 1989 remembrance is that, yeah, there might have been some protests within Hungary at the last moment, but there never really was the type of organized democratic opposition to challenge the Hungarian communists like we saw in Poland, or even the more visible street demonstrations in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and even Romania. So it largely was an elite-driven phenomenon that transitioned the country, and that continued really patterns of corruption, patronage, and elitism among urban political circles within Budapest. So while the country was certainly included within the first generation of groups to be considered for EU membership, all focus really was on this political clientele within Budapest, right? And it was just sort of assumed that the rest of the country would follow suit. We see by 08, 09, right, that there are some, considerable discrepancies between the quality of life in a, true European capital and the rest of the country, which, is by comparison quite developed, but also comparatively speaking, rural. So it's not a surprise that this national populist backlash comes within two parties, Fidesz and Jobbik. And I want to begin with Fidesz because this is the political party of Viktor Orban, right? If there is anybody that set the mold for this type of illiberal democratic political culture in Central Europe, it's him. And it is Orban that provides sort of a role model for Kaczynski in Poland, Vučić in Serbia, among others. And we can kind of put Orban on the same political level as, let's say, Marine Le Pen, Recep Erdogan, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Nigel Farage. I guess out of all of those, Putin is the one that stands above. Like, I like to sort of think that Orban looks to Putin as some kind of, power broker, patronizing leader, but people in the rest of Europe, especially in the post-communist world, look to Orban. Like, he's kind of like a lowercase Putin. But, however way that you want to look at it, Fidesz has effectively controlled Hungary and has enjoyed single-party control of the Hungarian parliament since 2010. Now, Hungary is a proportionally representative electoral system. So that means that Fidesz gets more than 50% of the vote, which leads you to think of a couple of things. A, Fidesz must really be popular among the Hungarian electorate, but equally likely B, any kind of political opposition in Hungary has either lost huge amounts of legitimacy among the electorate or is relegated only to the privileged neighborhoods of Budapest and other major urban cities. Whatever the case is, Orban's control over Hungary has given him the ability of systemically being able to change Hungary's constitutional law and jurisprudence. Now, he comes in 2010, along with his party, as a reformer, right? He initially is very pro-democratic. He's pro-Western, right? His goal is basically to do to Hungary in 2010 what should have been done in 89-90. Right? So the narrative of Fidesz is that Hungary never really transitioned. It just kind of evolved from the old communist guard into really the same kind of people, but just a different name. So there never was that cathartic moment in which the old communist political elite was removed from its power monopoly and the people finally had an opportunity to take control of their country's fate. So when he comes in 2010 as this reformer, who is going to clean up the country, get rid of all of these draconian laws that are still connected with the old Kadarist era, he is seen as somebody, he's like a fresh face, right? He's a fresh breath of air. He's someone who's going to come in and just, clean the country and the capital of all of its fat cats and other, populist rhetoric. But since being in power, and here is where the paradox comes in, he's very much pro-EU, at least when it comes to economics. Right? So he's not leading any kind of initiative to remove Hungary from the EU a la Brexit. But he does challenge many of the policies and programs of the EU, especially when it's socio-political and socio-cultural. So he sees the EU for what it really is, an economic regulatory body. He openly challenges and rejects the EU for any kind of neoliberal identity politics-driven initiatives that it wants to promote. So that, of course, includes halting any notion of asylum seekers. If people from the Middle East are coming into Europe and they're coming in through Serbia, Croatia, or whatever into Hungary, there really is two choices. One, you're going to keep going, right? So we're not going to have you stop in Hungary. Right? If you made it this far, you kind of want to make it to Austria or Germany. We'll put you on a bus and we'll just keep you going, but you can't stop here. If Hungary is told that it needs to fulfill a certain quota for asylum seekers, Orban's going to just simply say no. And if I can't move them into Europe, into Germany, to be more specific, I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to put border guards along the Hungarian, Serbian, and Hungarian-Croatian border and keep them there, right? That's basically as far as it's going to go. For the reasons that I mentioned beforehand, right? Hungary is not open for non-Europeans. The general understanding is that anyone who wants to come, move, and live in Hungary is willing to do so, provided that they, A, follow the rules, B, learn the language, and C, assimilate into the Hungarian culture. Then anyone can do that. But if these groups are not going to, and, we have to do things like, build mosques and create cultural centers for them, that's just not going to happen at all. And while this rubs cosmopolitan neoliberals the wrong way, right? And Orban is kind of seen, as I mentioned, as a lowercase Vladimir Putin. He does enjoy a lot of support among Hungarians, especially outside of Budapest, who see him as being that politician who, and this you'll get this with a lot of populist parties, says what we think. Right? He speaks on behalf of the silent majority. And so in this sense, Orban has really tapped into a pre-existing resentful, disgruntled, and disillusioned Hungarian public that isn't necessarily as happy about the turn of events of 88 to 91 as many people outside would. But more to the point, and this plays into Orban's strategy, is that he does enjoy the existence of one other political party, which at least traditionally has been more right-wing, more xenophobic, and more blatantly neo-Nazi than Fidesz. Now, Fidesz at the end of the day is still somewhat of a centrist party. At least its ideological roots might be, more in the neoliberal center. Jobbik is definitely a greater Hungarian party, one that openly and unapologetically is ethnocentric and xenophobic. In fact, the logo for Jobbik embodies the old, Hungarian crown lands. Right? So if you, remember, if you're, a history buff out there, Hungary used to be a lot bigger. And we're basically not that far away from it. About 100 or so years ago, right, the Kingdom of Hungary was an integral part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And within the Austrian Empire, you can kind of break it up really into three general categories. You've got the Austrian areas, which is today's Austria, South Tyrol, Slovenia, a good chunk of the Czech Republic and southern Poland, along with Austria's only real colony, Bosnia. A lot of good that did them. Is where World War I began. But there was also a preset piece of territory, the old Kingdom of Hungary, which goes back about 1,000 years or so. And it was kind of assumed that if the Austrian Empire was going to break up after losing World War I, that, Hungary, within its ancient monarchical borders, would emerge. And, well, the post-war treaties were like, not so fast. To which Hungary loses somewhere about 2/3 of its territory, right? So a good chunk of this goes to Croatia, northern Serbia. This is all Transylvania and Banat. The entire country of Slovakia emerges from this, along with this little area here, Zakarpattia, which goes to Ukraine, and the rest of this goes to Poland. So the logo of Jobbik is basically what we would today call Greater Hungary. Now, Jobbik is one of those parties that speaks on behalf of all ethnic Hungarians throughout Central Europe. Those that are living in Serbia, Croatia, especially Romania. Jobbik is one of those parties where, well, you can kind of look at their uniforms and draw your own conclusions. Within Hungary itself, Jobbik openly and unapologetically targets the Roma community. And this involves everything from nighttime torchlight marches through Roma communities and villages to some of its members openly advocating the removal of Roma populations and concentrating them, oh dear God, you know where I'm going with this, in a bunch of camps, right? So, Jobbik, at least up until recently, right, was openly neo-Nazi. So Orban's type of strategic, power-broking conservatism and populism definitely benefited from Jobbik in the sense that he can present himself as the alternative to the Nazi crazies and provide somewhat more of a sophisticated, professional level of defense of Hungarian identity without having to resort into, the Nazi ideology and symbolism. And this, ladies and gentlemen, has produced a rather successful brand of what many call Orbanism, right? Orban has sort of created this playbook for a number of, top-heavy executive leadership throughout the post-communist world to present themselves at the same time as people who will cooperate with Europe, but are not going to just simply open their country up to all sorts of, outside values, beliefs, and practices. So, Orban's playbook has given a rather clear strategy of how one can be part of Europe without having to become European. And this is really the most interesting thing out there because Orban has challenged the idea of what it means to be quote-unquote European, which of course is in this case understood to be multicultural, cosmopolitan, gay-friendly, non-national, by saying this is a relatively new and unfamiliar term to most people. To be European, Orban argues, is to embrace Christianity, embrace national emblems and symbols, to understand that Europe is white, Christian, specifically like Western Christian, and proud of its unique histories. Oh? So like anybody who's ever been to Europe, especially that part of Europe, I'm talking about Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, former Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia, whatever. You can't go more than a few kilometers without running into some kind of monument or ruin or something that is related to the country's early history of defending itself against the Ottoman Turks. Right? Some castle, some plaque, some memorial, some whatever, it's just like whatever, right? The whole country's identity was based on resisting the Turk, resisting the Ottoman, pushing them back. This is especially true of Central Europe, more so than the Balkans, which underwent Ottoman occupation for a number of centuries. So Orban's narrative is that to be Hungarian is to embrace specific Hungarian qualities. And it's not necessarily racist, he argues. He has absolutely no problem with the same type of identity values coming out of Poland or Croatia or Serbia. So it's not Hungarians are better than other Europeans, but it's that Hungarians need to remind other Europeans that they have the same set of values that should not be diluted for the sake of inclusiveness, but brought up, right? This is the whole idea, is that, look, Hungary, along with a lot of these other neighbors, they're small states, right? It's what we call small state syndrome. This is definitely part of the cathartic memory of the breakup of the Hungarian crown lands at the Treaty of Trianon a century ago. And while Orban doesn't openly call for the readjustment of borders as some more extremist members of Jobbik, Orban plays into this idea of, okay, we've made our peace, right? Hungary is small, it's broken, we've gone through trauma. So with that said, whatever we have left, this is it, right? There is no other group, there's no other country out there that speaks Hungarian, so we have to defend what is ours. And what is ours should not be just taken for granted by anybody else. So it's a type of statism that works against open border policies. Right? One can come to Hungary, and you're going to get this in the United States as well, right? Anybody can come to the United States if they do so legally, learn the language, assimilate, follow the rules, right? That's just, my people did that, you people should do that as well. So that's the identity. That's the idea that Orban promotes. And it not only attracts a good degree of followers within Hungary, because it's like, this is all that we got, but it can be replicated, right, throughout the rest of the region, within Slovakia, Serbia, Croatia, and Poland for that matter. So in this sense, Orban has created himself to be this stalwart, this defender of traditional Hungarian values against other elements. And probably no other person serves as the antithesis to Orban than George Soros. Right? And especially those that, engage in, all sorts of right-wing conspiracy theories, anti-globalism, anti-cosmopolitanism. For whatever reason, George Soros is always at the forefront of that, right? He's up there with the Rothschilds, the Clintons, the Bilderbergers, the Rockefellers, whatever it is, right? International global finance or whatever. And the fact that Soros is Hungarian doesn't hurt, right? But Soros is completely synonymous with international conspiracies to weaken the Hungarian state, dilute the Hungarian identity, and, impose all sorts of non-Hungarian, non-European values like gay marriage, transgender surgery, multi-ethnic inclusivity that includes people from the Middle East. Right? So it's a way of saying that borders are open in Hungary, but they come with gates and checkpoints. And this should be replicated in Poland, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Serbia, in Romania, right? In Croatia. So Hungary is a part of Europe, but Hungary likes to promote itself as not a plate, right? Visualize a plate, where you put food on. And you know how, you've got especially when you go to a buffet, you've got your meat, your potatoes, your gravy, your this, your that, and oh, look, they have pasta. I'm going to add pasta as well. But then you're kind of apprehensive because you put gravy on your meat and potatoes, but you don't want your gravy to be touching the pasta. So what's the next best thing? Well, we can't have two plates. How about one of those plates with little dividers in them? Think of those like TV dinners that you remember as eating as a kid, right? And these little dividers, right? Keep your gravy away from your peach cobbler. it keeps your ice cream away from your garlic. You know, it's like this is the knowledge of Orban's of Hungary. It's like, hey, I like pasta with tomato sauce. I like meatloaf with gravy. I don't want my tomato sauce getting into my gravy. I like ice cream. I like garlic. I don't want my garlic getting into my ice cream. So walls keep things pure and we can enjoy them as is, right? That's the idea of what Orban is all about, right? And because this, rifles the EU to no end, right? Because, the European Union actually has a very horrible way of dealing with people like Orban, because rather than trying to understand that this is the cultural blowback from technocratic approaches to modernization, they just simply reiterate their stance on multi-ethnic inclusivity without really understanding that national identity is still very strong and important, not just in Central Europe, but also in the Balkans. So because, the typical people from the EU are going to say what's expected of them from Orban circles, it only increases his stature and his legitimacy. So as a result, Orban has worked to solidify and improve relations with Russia. He gets along very good with Putin, with China. During Trump's term as president, Trump and Orban found a lot of commonalities, and even with the then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, when we get to Poland, we find things aren't as bad in the sense that state capture by one political party has not yet happened. The Law and Justice Party that currently enjoys a slim majority in the Polish parliament probably wants it to be this way, and Jaroslaw Kaczynski certainly has followed a lot of the strategies and guidelines set forth by his good friend and colleague Orban. But there are clear signs that Poland in the last few years has moved towards definitive patterns of parochialism, social conservatism, probably what we could regard as similar aspects of evangelicism in the United States here. Poland has, particularly under Kaczynski, really just dug its heels into the idea that Poland is the bastion of Catholicism in Europe, and it is going to use its Catholic history and heritage as a way of defending against a number of external threats. Liberal cosmopolitanism and globalization, Islamism, secularism, Europeanism. We're talking about a country in which followers of Kaczynski will effectively pray the gay away, pray the EU away, pray the migration away. And the thing is that this isn't so much a deviation from solidarity as it is one of those inconvenient participants of that movement, right? Solidarity, the name itself implies it was an all-encompassing collective group opposition against single-party communist rule. And one of the things that Poland reminds us of is that collective opposition eliminates the differences between and among opposition members because they're all united in one thing, right? Getting rid of the collectively hated government that is currently in power. So solidarity could include everyone and everything from liberal Democrats to monarchists to theocrats to anarchists to whoever and whatever. They all want one thing. The commies got to go. The Red Army needs to, withdraw, and we need to take our country back. This does not come into play until after the round table, right? This is one of the big elements about the downsides to negotiated transitions, because if the round table meeting provides such a successful transition of power, right, it implies that the moderates on both sides won out, right? Those within solidarity under Lech Walesa wanted to reach out to like-minded moderates and voices of reason within the Communist Party, and that's where the handshake and the signed documents and the transition of power happened. What this leaves out are the hardliners. And, the communist hardliners are basically dead at this point. But the democratic hardliners and even more so, the next generation of democratic hardliners are the ones that look at the events of 1989 and instead of praising Wałęsa and looking at Round Table as the defining moment of Poland's, civilizational maturity, they saw it as a sellout. Right? They saw it as a loss of opportunity, because what happens afterwards is the implementation of things that the sides at the table agreed to not bring up. One of which was looking at the communist period, especially the 1981 crackdown. Right? Poland did not have a 56 or a 68 moment. They had an 81. And in this case, it was before Solidarity was about to make a Polish Spring equivalent, right? The Soviet Union basically tells the communists in Poland to crack down before they get themselves involved. This is what brings Jaruzelski to power, right? Effectively, Poland is under martial law from 81 until 89, right? So it's kind of a quasi-military dictatorship. The thing is that Round Table allows Jaruzelski to retire, right? He's stripped of his rank, he's stripped of his titles, but he's given a pensioner's apartment in Warsaw. And the thing about it is that up until he died, right, you could go to Warsaw and almost like go on an unofficial tour where you could be like, oh yeah, there's Jaruzelski's apartment on some street corner. And every so often you might see some old cranky looking man sort of glaring at you from his windows before shutting the blinds. The man never saw, the inside of a jail cell. He never was held accountable for the 81 crackdown. So there were among the hardliners a number of conspiracy theories that spread the idea that the leaders of Solidarity were actually collaborators. They're actually like false communists, as a way of trying to almost do to Poland what happened in Hungary, which was not really overthrow the system, but salvage what could be salvaged, but give it a new aura, give it a new, identity. And because the smooth transition never really brought the communist officials to account, right? There was no tribunal, there were no mass arrests, there weren't even any executions. Like Hungary, the 89 moment avoided any attempt at introspective soul searching, right? If we agree to disagree and move forward for the sake of stability, there's a lot of things, a lot of raw things that we want to talk about. And, in the absence of closure, in the absence of really like, let's just bring it all out onto the table and talk it out, there is instead of pact of forgetting. Right? This idea that, well, we'll worry about that down the road, right? Especially if you follow the Spanish model, which I brought up in the previous lecture. This pacto olvido, this pact of forgetting is exactly what happened, is that we won't talk about what happened during the Civil War. We won't reveal where mass graves of communists and Republicans happen to be, just for the sake of keeping the country stable. And, if you're a part of Franco's government, well, this is the best thing that ever happened to you. And in Poland, if you were part of the old communists, you got one hell of a deal. But if you are a victim of the state terror, if you're a victim of these people, and, your parents or your brother or your friend or your relative or something, you want some kind of justice, it doesn't happen. And that's why Wałęsa was actually seen more as a traitor than anything else. And this is the narrative that was brought up and is still used today by the Law and Justice Party, particularly Jaroslaw Kaczynski. The narratives that are used are very similar to that of Hungary. And that is, first and foremost, Poland is part of Europe. Okay? No question about that. But a Europe that is not multicultural, inclusive, and Babylonian, but has unique histories, cultures, languages, heritages, all that need to be safeguarded, right? So rather than a museum of tolerance and inclusivity, we all need to have ethnographic museums. We all need to have days where we do our folk dances and have our folk costumes and bring out our heritage and our trinkets and our symbols. Poland has a unique history and a heritage, and it cannot be and should not be diluted for the sake of multiculturalism, especially if one looks at Poland as even more victimized historically than Hungary. right? Poland's entire history has been trying to maintain some identity at, at the risk of being taken over by either the Germans or the Russians. So Catholicism in Poland is more than just simply a religion. It's an identity. It's a way of defending Polish identity from Protestantism in northern Germany and Orthodoxy in Russia. And I even like to go so far as to joke that the Polish language, if any of you have seen Polish, I mean, I don't know why things are spelled the way that they are, but I'm pretty certain that the Polish language is as phonetically incomprehensible to outsiders as necessary as a way of just simply defending the language. There are times where I'll, joke, like, I can't read this in Polish. Can someone please give me the Cyrillic, variation? And I'm like, okay, I know exactly what you mean here. The point that I'm trying to raise is that Law and Justice has brought up many of the issues of identity, value, home, and hearth that were neglected, overlooked, not just by Valence's solidarity, but by the resulting negotiated transition in the 90s afterwards. And that's why Kaczynski's movement likes to call itself the founders of the so-called Fourth Polish Republic, right? Their goal is to, if they can, replace the tainted third, right? The Third Polish Republic is one that's established in 1989, 1990. And so if they can do to Poland what Hungary has done, what Orban has done to Hungary, right? And that is seize enough power to change the constitution enough to make a break from the previous regime, then that's what's going to happen. So these are the self-appointed hardliners of the Democratic vanguard in 1989. They see themselves as the true banner carriers of solidarity, as opposed to the traitors that sold their soul and the movement to the communists at the round table. So the idea is that these guys, these communists, were up against the wall. They had no leg to stand on, right? And so the idea is that you could have totally have crushed them in a true revolution, right? Forget this playing nice, right? Just go hard, go no mercy on them, and really establish a new country, a la revolution. That didn't happen. So these are the guys that believe that, the moderates and the centrists and the people that really are in favor of, breaching across the aisle in bipartisan compromise, blah, 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 really just sold the country out and lost a number of opportunities to make the country, better. And so in a way, what they're trying to do now is reassert what is truly important for Polish identity, collective value, and culture. And that is a mixture of social conservatism, Catholicism, and parochialism. Within these narratives, right, Law and Justice has retconned the history of solidarity as more than just simply a workers' movement, but as a social phenomenon that, like all previous elements of Polish national struggle in centuries past, have sought to defend the country against all non-Polish and anti-Polish forces, from Moscow to Brussels, from Marxism to multiculturalism. So as far as Law and Justice is concerned, anything that smacks of internationalism is anti-Polish. And part of that is making a number of arrangements with more conservative elements of the Catholic Church to promote the growth of families, certainly to address the declining population within Poland. And that, of course, means raging against principles of feminism, making it much more difficult for wives to divorce their husbands. And as far as the EU is concerned, implementing the most severe abortion law, anti-abortion laws, and anti-LGBTQ laws within the institution. Now, when we compare them to what's happening in the United States, Poland is still far away being much more moderate. You compare that with what's happening in the United States, and it's basically Poland versus Gilead. But the fact that at least 1/3 of Poland has now declared themselves to be part of this new LGBTQ free zone, right? Which implies that the gays have either been kicked out, rehabilitated, or just simply prayed away, is a unique thing, not just in the EU, but I think throughout all of Europe. And this, is more than just simply a revitalized Catholic Church. It's a way of addressing rather open abortion laws that took place during the communist period. And by and large, folks, during the communist period, it was very easy for women to go to a medical facility and get an abortion. This was not even considered to be a moral issue. It was considered to be more of a medical thing. Now it has become that, right? Law and Justice, along with the hardliners in the Catholic Church, which love Kaczynski, like just love him to death, are using this opportunity to implement what they hoped to achieve after Roundtable in '89. But all of that stuff was eliminated for the sake of, economic modernization. One final country that I want to look at, and that is Slovakia. Now, I know that we're skipping over the Czech Republic. There's not much to talk about the Czech Republic. Suffice to say right now, the Czech Republic has remained relatively in the hands of political oligarchs. Nationalism in the Czech Republic really isn't that big of a thing when we look at the other three countries. The Czechs are... their identity is unique all of their own. They're the least religious people in all of Europe, so they're not really all that keen on promoting a sense of historical Czech identity. I think the only time that Czechs really get angry at you is when you criticize the quality of their beer. That's about it. But and there's not much that's written about the Czech Republic, unfortunately. So I just want to move to Slovakia before we end this discussion here, and that's connected with the article that I recently published about the parliamentary elections within the country. Of the four, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, Slovakia was kind of the bad boy, the remedial kid. In comparison to the Balkans, Slovakia was doing great. But within the alpha group of Central European countries, Slovakia was the one that lagged behind. There was a persistent political culture of elite-based clientelism surrounding these three Fs, faith, family, and fatherland, since the early 90s, right? So what became a new thing in Poland and Hungary in the 2000s, Slovakia had kind of gone through this right after not just transition, but when the country broke apart. When Czechoslovakia split in '93, the Czech Republic just kind of becomes its own little urban-y hipster country, whereas Slovakia is much more rural, parochial, heavily Catholic, and overwhelmingly conservative. Its leadership, up until recently, was characterized really by two incredibly charismatic individuals. Vladimir Mečiar, who basically ran the country throughout the 90s, and Robert Fico, who up until recently was the country's major political power broker. So while there was political pluralism within the country, there was really the sense of one party had a comparative advantage over the others. And these parties were largely mass-based, right? There wasn't that much ideology that came into it, but it was kind of these catch-all parties that could be whatever one wanted or whatever was expedient for the time. So one could look at this and say, okay, it's political flexibility, but at the same time, it also was a way of looking at, state capture by people who were able to change hats and anagrams whenever they needed to, just for the sake of remaining in power, right? So the notion of top-down autocratic control of an alleged democratic country continued up until, really a few years ago. And I think that the big watershed moment that ultimately brought the public to finally reject, right, this link between political oligarchs and other unaccountable organizations, particularly organized crime, was the murder of the young journalist Jan Kuciak in 2018. Kuciak is in his early 20s, if I'm not mistaken, and he was investigating the links between the then government of Robert Fico and a number of organized crime syndicates throughout the country. And he paid for it with his life. In investigating this one politician, people had threatened him constantly until one day some people came to the door of his apartment and murdered him along with his girlfriend. This was the enough is enough moment. People in Slovakia aren't used to things like this. And this was the moment that just brought hundreds of thousands of people out into the streets. Kuciak became this martyr for the oppressed, the ignored, the exploited within the country. And it actually was his murder that led to an enormous drop in support for Fico, and inevitable elections that led to first Fico's resignation as the prime minister of Slovakia, and then ultimately the fall from power of his party. Now, before we get into the more specifics of Slovakia, I also need to mention one other major political party, and that is the People's Party, Our Slovakia, run by this dude right here in the middle, Marian Kotleba, who we think he's doing a really good job cosplaying as a stormtrooper. Every one of these countries has right-wing, quasi-neo-Nazi movements. Jobbik we already talked about in Hungary. The Our People's Party in Slovakia is an unapologetic neo-Nazi party, and they've been so from the start. From their point of view, they see themselves as the heir of the Slovak Republic, which was this independent puppet state of the Nazis in the Second World War. So for them, they see the leadership of Josef Tiso, who was a little, puppet of Hitler, as their progenitor, as their founder. And you got to really think about yourself. Why would you want to see yourself as the heir of a Nazi puppet state? But Slovakia is not the only one within Central Europe. One of the real inconvenient truths about a lot of these countries is, when you look into their history, almost all of them, almost every single one of them had factions that openly, happily, and unarguably collaborated with the Nazis. And this is something that, Kotleba has apparently no problem doing. And if you think to yourself that the party is small and peripheral, by last check here, they not only are represented in the Slovak parliament, but they're gaining in support. They can usually enjoy somewhere between 8 to 13% of the popular vote. And so that makes them a visible presence. They're not just some kooky little crazy peripheral movement. Like, they get into the parliament. They pass the electoral threshold. So that leads us to ask, is there any respite in Central Europe? We've been talking about parties that are either top-down, quasi-authoritarian, or far-right. Is there any party, is there any movement, is there anything out there that might give us some reason to be optimistic? And, about 2 years ago, we were introduced to Zuzana Čaputová, who represented a newly created political party in Slovakia, the Progressive Slovakia Party. And she ran as the country's president, which was a largely ceremonial role, right? So there's no real power in parliament. But she ran on a platform of anti-corruption, anti-elitism, anti-status quo, overwhelmingly pro-EU, in favor of women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and really challenging the then beleaguered but still very powerful political faction of Fico's Smer SD. Her primary opponent, Maroš Šefčovič, was an endorsed candidate by Fico. So that already kind of tainted his qualifications, because Fico was already regarded as dangerous, unpopular by the public. This is following the Kuciak murder. So Čaputová does win. She doesn't win by a wide margin, but she does win. She becomes Slovakia's first female president. And Western media is just awash in optimism, right? This is the reverse trend of populism across Central Europe. Čaputová is going to be the bulwark against Orban and Kaczynski, and is going to, turn the country around and bring Central Europe back into the fold of Euro neoliberalism. And, a lot of us that were, looking at this were saying, well, not so fast. It's a great victory, but that doesn't say anything about the parliament. And whether progressive Slovakia would repeat its surprise victory in the following year's parliamentary elections remained to be seen. And unfortunately, when we did get to them, Chapotova's party, which I have circled here, it's in a coalition, PS and Spolu. This was almost painful to see. The party coalition going into the elections won 6.96% of the popular vote. Now, within parliamentary threshold voting, if you're a standalone party, you got to get 5% of the vote in order to get in. Because PS already coalitioned with an existing party, that threshold was bumped up to 7%. So all the votes that went for the party were thrown out. Now, the vote and the election was a referendum on Fico's smer, which was widely regarded to not just lose, but to lose its hold on forming a governing coalition. The surprise victor in that election was the one all the way on the left that I have here, Oľano, which is a sort of another catch-all, non-ideological political party characterized by its leader, Igor Matović, who embraces a type of political entrepreneurialism. So the point to be made here as far as Slovakia, which I do have to say is probably the most dynamic of all four countries right now, is that the transition was largely, if anything, a movement away from the charismatic leadership of Fico as the country's undisputed power broker. He is now widely discredited, largely washed up. He still controls smer, but he no longer wields the degree of power and power brokerage that he once did. But Fico's style of government, very similar to that of Mečiar, his predecessor, was by and large elite-driven political opportunism. Right? There really wasn't any ideology. Smer is a social democratic, sort of left-of-center party, at least in the brochure on the website. But in reality, Smer just became this opportunistic party that would do anything possible to maintain its monopoly on power. And part of that meant just being associated with high degrees of corruption and dismissive, understandings of the public. Fico was just this horrible person in the camera. Like, he was not charismatic. He really just showed his utter indifference, almost disgust, for the average Slovak. So he just became the envisioned embodiment of elitism, corruption, privilege, and stuff. The head of Oľano, which is an acronym for the Ordinary People and Independent Entrepreneurs Party. It's sort of a catch-all political entrepreneurs thing that it's populist in character, but it's centrist in nature, right? Its intention is to be a non-political political party. So the way that it reaches out to the electorate is, hey, are you tired of the status quo? Are you fed up with politics as usual, but you realize you need to participate in elections in order to kick these people out of power? Well, boy, do I have a political party for you, right? It's kind of like a all-encompassing, none of the above, will be whatever you want kind of movement. Matović is not a seasoned politician. He started out as a business person. Kind of moved into civic activism, but felt the need to translate that into politics really as a way of cleaning up the country, right? Sort of operating on principles of anti-corruption, anti-elitism, anti-oligarchism. And, the rage among the public certainly played out, where Oľano is a new party, untainted with the back history of all of these other squabbling, political movements. So while it won the, plurality of votes, it ended up needing to form a coalition with a smaller number of parties, largely, if anything else, to keep out the two biggest problems in Parliament. And that was Smer still holds on to 38 seats, and the goal was to make certain that they were not in power. Oh, and we got to keep the Nazi crazies out, right? These guys, this is Kotleba's party, 17 seats. So Oljano comes away with 53 seats in parliament and forms a coalition with 3 other parties: For the People, We Are Family, and Freedom and Solidarity, all of which represent some kind of conservative to parochial to conservative populist movement. So for a party that advertised itself as being above ideology, its governing coalition is largely based on smaller political parties that keep the country more so within the social conservative parochial elements, right? And this was largely as a way of more or less just keeping out the 2 other parties. We don't want Smer, and we certainly don't want LSNS. So when you're forming a governing coalition, there are, certain parties that you immediately blackball that you don't want to work with. Now, the problem that we have here is that Matovic isn't one of the easiest people to get along with. And the head of SAS, Richard Sulik, worked with Matovic beforehand. So before he was part of Oljano, Matovic was a member of Freedom and Solidarity, and he just constantly came into conflict with Sulik. So this was really a coalition formed begrudgingly more than anything else, more so to keep the other 2 bookended parties out of power. Since the formation of government, Smer has actually split into 2. There was a reckoning within Smer to oust Fico as the head of the party, because the guy was just seen as radioactive, toxic. The guy was just going to bring the party down. Its deputy head, Peter Pellegrini, was offering to take control of the party. But he threatened to break away and form his own party if Fico refused to step down. Fico did just that, and Pellegrini, made good on his threat and, took about 11 or so MPs from the current Smer arrangement and formed a new party, Hlas, which means head. And now sits within the Slovak parliament, and he kind of remains now, interestingly enough, Pellegrini remains the most popular politician after Chapotova. Matovic has a very brief honeymoon period when the government forms. He's given initial praise for the country's handling of COVID, but then that strategy quickly collapses once the virus spreads. He's engaged in some kind of internal party maneuvering, whatever it happened to have been, but Sulik of SAS threatened to pull out of the coalition if Matovic remained the country's prime minister. So there was an internal party shift. Matovic is now out. The arrangement is still the same, but there's a new head of the Oljano government. And local radio chatter now indicates that Pellegrini's Hlas party is emerging as the newest, most popular, hottest thing out there, which, like Oljano, is a catch-all, non-ideological, entrepreneurial party. So, this is the pattern that we find in Slovakia. A little different from Hungary and Poland, but it shows the dynamism of a region that we long regarded as solved and no longer worthy of observation. So what does this all tell us? I mean, between this and last lecture on Central Europe, it shows us that populism is not symptomatic of any cultural legacy of poor democratic practice so much as it is a response to the nature of authoritarian transition and external influence since 1990. Obviously, the cultural factor matters, and it was something that was overlooked by many policymakers, technocrats, and international observers in the late 80s and early 90s. It was just sort of assumed that culture would be tempered by the European Union's guiding force. And okay, be that as it may, the countries got into the EU. They are structurally, democratically consolidated states. But that leaves the cultural issue, which was previously unattended, to now kind of take on lives and reactions of their own in response to the nature of neoliberal democratic transition, which, if anything, shows us, this is the great thing about Central Europe, it shows us that these approaches have limited success in producing modernization and development. In other words, throwing money at a country, modernizing it, investing in outside companies and industries, and just, tethering these smaller states to the EU is not going to make life better for everyone. Corruption, oligarchism, nepotism, organized criminal syndicates, an angry and increasingly restless countryside are going to find ways to show their discontentment. And I think the best example of this is the Our Slovakia party by Kotleba. To a lesser extent, we see this in Jobbik in Hungary, but a lot of that is taken up by Orban's Fidesz, which I should reiterate again, Jobbik is Orban's best friend because Fidesz can take the most potent elements of Jobbik and sort of de-fascistify it, denazify it, make it a little bit more palatable for the middle class, but still aiming to defend small little Hungary's identity from the larger encroachment of European cosmopolitanism. But what it also shows us, and this is something that I believe is indicative across most beleaguered liberal democracies in the world today, the traditional political center that we all regard as sacred and that which must be defended at all costs is hollowing out. They're losing legitimacy, and they're failing to adapt to rapid socio-political change. Slovakia, again, gives us a great example of this, right? Čaputova's victory as Slovakia's president might have gotten a lot of liberals happy because they thought, oh my God, it's great. She's young, she's a female, she's anti-populist, she's pro-EU. Slovakia is coming in from the dark. And I opined at the time by saying that her victory was less a victory for liberalism so much as it was a rejection against corruption and a decadent, decaying status quo. And I was right, because the victory of progressive Slovakia was not translated into parliamentary elections. More to the point, we find these catch-all, be-whatever-you-want parties that are replacing catch-all, be-whatever-you-want parties, right? If the political center is just tethered to neoliberal economic indicators without cultural factors taken into account, that stuff is going to be taken and appropriated by right-wing movements. And, we see this with Law and Justice in Poland, Fidesz and Jobbik in Hungary, LSNS in Slovakia, and people are like, oh my God, we gotta stop this. We gotta defend the country. Well, how do you defend it? More Euroliberalism. No, that's not how it works. Okay? Euroliberalism will not work against national populism. That's why the political center is hollowing out in Central Europe, as we'll see next week in Southeastern Europe. And I hate to break it to people who, read The Economist and see this as canon, but Western Europe as well. And in the absence of any organized political left, like we see in, let's say, Podemos in Spain, or whatever democratic socialist movement, nascent movement exists in the United States, or for a brief moment what Labour tried to market itself as in the UK, socioeconomic grievances that would otherwise go to these movements and parties will be exploited as socio-cultural problems by an emerging illiberal populist right, determined not to undermine democracy, but to save it from itself. So all these right-wing movements in Central Europe that's espousing, xenophobic illiberal populism are attracting people that aren't racist per se, but have enormous problems with socioeconomic inequalities, right? They are working class. They do find it difficult to maintain the cost of living. They do understand that the European Union is not giving them or providing them what was promised. And that's not to say that they're there waiting for handouts, but it's that all of the money, the investment, and the future lies in these capital cities that force people to leave their local areas, their towns, and their villages. Now, you can still eke out a living in places where Kotleba campaigns, but it's poorer, it's more rural, and here's the best thing. These elitist politicians in Bratislava never go to these villages. Kotleba does. He talks with them, he drinks with them, he speaks their language. They see him as one of their own. Right? These right-wing parties, which vow to defend hearth and home, are much more active. They do all the grassroots movements that these otherwise liberal Eurostructural parties don't. These centrist parties just sit there and wait for the phone to ring from Brussels or Berlin or wherever. And these right-wing parties are the ones that are organizing people outside of the capital. So when people look at the political climate of Central Europe today and they're wondering what went wrong, or why are people so racist, or what did we miss, or is this just another residue from the communist period, I'm thinking to myself, look, this is what happens when you misunderstand 1989, but also when you continue to think that the 1990s was nothing more than just throwing money and loans at countries and telling them to, forget their little cultural idiosyncrasies for the sake of multicultural inclusivity. This is what ends up happening, right? This is what happens. And without left-wing movements to take these legitimate grievances but detach them from xenophobia, well, this is what you're going to get. So Central Europe, far more interesting than this class when it was originally created led us to believe. Right? Central Europe is really the test lab for what we will see in other areas of the post-communist world. So, I don't know whether this ends on a note of optimism, pessimism, or just simply, being realistic. But we're going to find a lot of these Orbanistic patterns on display in the countries of Southeastern Europe for next week, particularly in Serbia and Croatia. But before we finish out this week, I've got one more lecture in which Jan Kubik is going to be our guest speaker for the hour, so you're not going to want to miss that one. So I hope that you found this stuff to be informative, especially for those of you who are enrolled in class. This should flesh out a lot of the material from our readings. I will see you all one last time for this week before we change gears, rent a Yugo, and start driving through the Balkans. So see you next time, everyone.